2013, Naughty Dog developed and released The Last of Us for the Sony PlayStation 3. The story focused on that of Joel, a smuggler tasked with escorting a young girl by the name of Ellie across a post-apocalyptic United States of America devastated by a parasitic contagion in hopes of meeting up with the rebellious organization of the Fireflies to try and find a cure for the contagion as well as rebuilding civilization itself. The game's story was praised for its realism and depictions of how people would actually or realistically treat one another on themselves if civilization were to indeed collapse in such a way due to a virus or illness. Henry and Sam were a pair that Joel and Ellie came across while heading to meet up with the Fireflies. Due to the circumstances and details mentioned in-game for the characters, they were relatable to the situation that Joel and Ellie themselves went through in terms of experiences. The situation had details that Henry was an only child when the fungal infection first occurred, and Sam only knew life after the outbreak had occurred. Henry was able to relate with Joel over remembering life before the civilization-wide collapse, and Sam was able to relate to Ellie with all that they'd ever known was the pandemic and chaos that occurred with life due to the fact that all of the survivors born after the infection, that was all they had ever known. When Sam was infected, and Henry's reaction to the infection, with the pair of them dying, with Joel and Ellie as witnesses, it was often considered to be one of the most emotional moments of the entire game. At the time, players and critics didn't think that such a graphic and brilliant moment would be done immediately as it was in that particular point of the game. Theories were discussed that such a moment was implemented within the game on purpose, due to the fact that roughly at that particular time in the game, the player almost developed a sense of security or normalcy within the game. The abrupt infection of Sam and suicide of Henry jolted players back into the mindset that when playing The Last of Us was an experience that was always graphic and almost always depressing, and that there was nothing good in the game for Joel or Ellie or even the players controlling them to experience. Clerical details were that despite Joel and Ellie getting along with Henry and Sam, the four of them became somewhat friendly with one another. After Sam had become infected, Henry indirectly blamed Joel and Ellie for it, and later killed himself rather than admit the fact that it was just the cruel circumstances of life that the parasitic fungal contagion had, and Sam was just a victim of it. Unlike Sam, who was hardened by the life that the infection had put upon him, Henry was actually somewhat more optimistic of the situations that they found themselves in, from the conversations that he had with Joel and Ellie throughout their time together. However, after he became infected and hid that particular detail, after he had become infected, and he hid that fact from her, his personality towards Sam's attitude degraded even more. Sam was still innocent and gentle, childlike even, but after being infected, there was nothing left, and he knew that fact. Sam had received a toy from Ellie and at first valued it due to his innocence. He was still a child, as mentioned, but after knowing he was infected and that he would die, he no longer cared for it. At the time, Ellie didn't know why, but one of the last comments to her was the fact that details of the conversation they had were about heaven and hell, and even if the infected couldn't see their family once they had died or turned, as mentioned in the game, for the symptoms. Sam isolated himself from the others and remained separated until he tragically succumbed to the infection, technically dying alone, and that all that remained was the parasite. The characters of Henry and Sam were minor yet remained within the gamer fan database of The Last of Us for so long that players wanted more of the characters due to the fact that the story featuring them in that segment was so gripping and so interesting. Some players had even made comments online that there should have been some sort of Henry and Sam downloadable content to have an extra glimpse into the pair of them on their adventures or trials trying to survive prior to them meeting Joel and Ellie, but this never occurred. Further details about Henry and Sam as characters were that when the game was originally being developed and conceived, that the ethnicity of the characters would be of European or white heritage instead of the African or black heritage as depicted and shown in the final version of The Last of Us. In the final version of The Last of Us, the backstory for Henry and Sam isn't really mentioned nor depicted well, but the English language voice actor suggested a backstory for Henry and Sam's relationship, as the actor mentioned that he would have had Sam being the actual half-brother of Henry, a result of Henry's mother being raped and dying during the childbirth due to the collapse of civilization at the time. Combining this theory with the in-game background information for Henry and Sam, it had Henry being the age of 5 years when the cordyceps brain infection first began. When he was 12 years of age, this was when Sam was born. So if the proposed theory of Sam being the product of rape occurred, it meant that Henry's mother was trying to survive with him for a period of years before she was later raped and impregnated. The actor continued with Henry contemplating killing the child to rid himself of the rage that he had felt over his mother's rape and death due to the childbirth, but later changed his mind, dedicating his life to caring for Sam because he believed that the suffering his family endured had to have some sort of meaning. Even with the reference to Henry and Sam in The Last of Us Part 2, reminded players of the characters and how good storytelling within a video game can leave a lasting impact on the story of the game, as well as the experience people have when playing it. Sometimes a character can be forgotten because the experience was too sad or tragic to remember.